we are now facing, I think, in the third nuclear age, a challenge that I think is rather distinct from the kinds of things we thought about during the Cold War, which is the problem of limited nuclear use. This idea that military establishments could see the detonation of one or a small number of nuclear weapons as an instrumental way to accomplish their political, military, or tactical objectives in a time of crisis or war. We did worry about that in the Cold War, but during the Cold War, Kennedy and Khrushchev were both terrified that if they play their cards wrongly, the world ends up on fire. And today, I don't think that kind of a humbling sense of fear really pervades the establishments that control nuclear forces, right?
This is an interview with Ankit Panda. Ankit is a senior Stanton Fellow at the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he is an expert on nuclear strategy, arms control, missile defense, nonproliferation, and deterrence. And in this conversation, we talk about everything related to nuclear weapons. Why are they coming back into fashion? Why are we living through another nuclear arms race? Why are states and their leaders increasingly more comfortable with the idea of a limited nuclear war? And much, much more. The corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And it's also supported by generous patrons that you can join to get access to various perks and to help make this podcast possible. And now, enjoy the conversation. All right, so welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So I'd like to start with a little bit of a historical context, because from my uninformed perspective, when it comes to nuclear weapons, it sort of seems like there are these different periods from the 1950s and 1960s when the use of nuclear weapons was actually quite a realistic option in the Cuban crisis or the Korean War. Then in the 70s, 80s, when it seemed like everyone sort of accepted the mutual assured destruction concept, and it was a little more stabilized. And then from 19s onwards, where in the unipolar world, it seemed like nuclear weapons were a bit of a relic of the past, perhaps. At least that's my perception. And today, it seems like it's changing again. And perhaps the nuclear weapons are coming back to the main stage once again. So within that historical context, where do you think we are today when it comes to nuclear weapons?
Yeah, so generally, I think that's a pretty accurate summary of our predicament. I think the three distinct eras you talk about are what scholars will broadly describe as the first, second, and third nuclear age. The third nuclear age, or new nuclear age, as I like to call it, is what we are currently at the doorstep of or arguably we're a few years into this new nuclear age. And right, I mean, I think that broader recession of nuclear dangers in the 1990s led into this period of roughly 3 decades, I would say, wrapping up around 2019, 2020, where nuclear weapons didn't go away, but they were in the background of international politics. For the United States, for instance, we were focusing quite a bit after, obviously, the September 11th attacks in 2001 on counterinsurgency, land warfare in the Middle East. But these broader questions around strategic deterrence, nuclear warfare, strategic capabilities, even extended deterrence, really did not occupy the primary position that they once did during the Cold War. And so that is the predicament that we're in today. And of course, this interacts with a number of other global geopolitical dynamics. The declining relations among the three major powers is really the big one here, right? The U.S., China, and Russia triangular relationship, where both the bilateral U.S.-Russia and U.S.-China relationships have precipitously declined as we head into this third nuclear age.
And would you say, if we compare it to the Cold War era, would you say that since in many ways we are, or at least many would say that we're in Cold War II, would you say that when it comes to nuclear weapons, that would apply as well? And we're once again where we used to be back in the 70s or even in the 60s?
So yes and no. I think one of the ways in which we might be in a second Cold War is the return of strategic nuclear dynamics between great powers. That was a defining characteristic of the systemic competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. I don't love the Cold War 2.0 analogy though, because I think it obscures more than it reveals. Arguably, many of the challenges we're facing today in the nuclear domain and more broadly are more severe than the Cold War, right? Even if you're just talking about the US-China competitive dynamic, China's economic strength eclipses the Soviet Union in many ways, and that has implications for how the U.S. has to think about deterring China and the consequences of a conflict over Taiwan, for instance. The other difference here is that the kinds of nuclear dangers are very different, right? During the height of the Cold War in the 1970s, Soviet and American arsenals ballooned to the tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, almost 70,000 at the highest levels of their respective forces. After the Cold War ended, the United States and Russia, which controlled well in excess of 95% of the world's nuclear weapons, did disarm in a really big way. Part of that was due to the presidential nuclear initiatives, which immediately saw the pullback of theater nuclear forces that were deployed overseas. But subsequently, as arms control agreements were implemented, the two sides did bring their forces down to today, where we are, which is a total aggregate nuclear weapons inventory around the world among the 9 states that possess them, just around a little under 13,000. And the other big difference is that the yields of nuclear weapons on average have gone down. And that's a good thing in the sense that if nuclear weapons were ever to be used or deterrence were ever to fail, the consequences of nuclear war, still terrible. I'm not underemphasizing that in any way, but considerably less bad than the truly apocalyptic consequences of the kind of megatonnage we had in aggregate between the United States and the Soviet Union being used at the height of the Cold War. But the bad thing here is that as nuclear weapons come down in yield, we are now facing, I think, in the third nuclear age, a challenge that I think is rather distinct from the kinds of things we thought about during the Cold War, which is the problem of limited nuclear use. This idea that military establishments could see the detonation of one or a small number of nuclear weapons as an instrumental way to accomplish their political, military, or tactical objectives in a time of crisis or war. We did worry about that in the Cold War, but during the Cold War, really, the historical evidence really suggests that both American and Soviet leaders and military planners assumed that escalation would not be controllable. And that belief in the uncontrollability of escalation really did contribute to the stabilizing effects of nuclear deterrence, because as we saw during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev are both terrified that if they play their cards wrongly, the world ends up on fire, essentially, what Kennedy called the final failure. And today, I don't think that kind of a humbling sense of fear really pervades the establishments that control nuclear forces, right? And part of that might also just have to do with the last 3 decades having inculcated a sense of general safety in the world, right? This idea that nuclear war was not something we really did have to think about. Unfortunately, all of those trends have regressed, and as I said, nuclear weapons are back at the forefront of international politics.
Does it make sense, this idea of a limited nuclear weapons use? Isn't it more of an illusion when we forget that if nuclear weapons would be limited by any actor, even in some very limited and targeted scenario, it could very easily lead to a nuclear escalation anyway?
So this is the thing with studying this stuff, right? I mean, all of us who work on this issue, myself and the generals in charge of fighting a nuclear war for the United States have all fought the same number of nuclear wars. So there is this open, endlessly debated question about the nature of nuclear escalation. Can escalation be controlled, or is escalation fundamentally uncontrollable? And that's not one that we're going to resolve on this podcast, unfortunately, but it's just worth stating that this is a tough problem that we grapple with in this field, where we don't have a lot of empirics on how nuclear wars are generally fought. My view is that limited nuclear use analytically, as somebody that seeks to understand the ways in which these risks are manifesting, is a real problem, that military establishments are drawn to this. Prescriptively, in terms of what I think should be done, I would obviously love to see a world where we don't have military establishments viewing limited nuclear use as a desirable way to fight wars or find their way out of a war, right? And I think that's fundamentally where the problem comes from, which is that games of nuclear deterrence or nuclear brinksmanship are usefully conceived of as competitive risk taking endeavors. So it's like gambling with your adversary, and As gamblers or poker players might know, I mean, there is a benefit to conveying to your adversary the stakes that you see in pressing your luck, conveying your resolve. And this is, deeply rooted in the Cold War era literature on limited nuclear use. Thomas Schelling, writing at the time of the early 1960s in the context of the Berlin crisis, reflects that a limited nuclear detonation is far more important in what it conveys politically to the other side than in terms of what it accomplishes militarily on the battlefield. And this is exactly the kind of discussion we've had over Ukraine, right? I mean, would Vladimir Putin be willing to use nuclear weapons over Ukraine to demonstrate just how much greater his stakes are in accomplishing his military goals vis-a-vis the goals of NATO, for instance, right? And so that is the essential logic of limited nuclear use. It is about signaling, it is about conveying to the other side that the stakes for you are so great that you're willing to cross the nuclear threshold, you're willing to invite the other side to walk over the brink with you towards Armageddon. And that is really powerful because in the United States, for instance, only the president of the United States can make the decision to use nuclear weapons, either first or in retaliation. And if the president of the United States observes an adversary use a nuclear weapon in a limited way, that person, who probably isn't a nuclear strategist or steeped in anything like deterrence literature, may be fundamentally humbled by that possibility, right? And I think we see this a lot in the historical record too, with how real world presidents from Kennedy to Reagan, even on the Soviet side, someone like Brezhnev, Khrushchev in the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis, even today, Joe Biden, the ways in which he's talked about nuclear risks in the context of Ukraine. The prospect of nuclear war does remain fundamentally humbling. And so this is the reason why I think limited nuclear use starts to look attractive potentially. And of course, it is attractive under many circumstances, under circumstances where a conventional war is protracted with no clear pathway to victory, like potentially what we're seeing between Russia and Ukraine today, or most importantly, in the context of a conventional defeat, right? Let's say the US manages to repel a invasion by China across the Taiwan Strait. Could Chinese leaders view limited nuclear use as a ways to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, essentially, right? To try to make a desperate last second play to convey to the United States that China is willing to take exceptional risks. So, these are some scenarios more far fetched than others, but this is, I think, a defining feature of what we're likely to be concerned with, right? Big difference with the Cold War, where a lot of thinking about nuclear war and escalation really was concerned with those big intercontinental warfare scenarios where you have massive exchanges between the United States and the Soviet Union. I don't think anybody really working on nuclear war or nuclear risks today really thinks that that is how a nuclear war would begin in the 21st century. Most likely, a nuclear war would begin with limited use rising out of an intense conventional crisis or a conventional war.
Maybe to dig even a little deeper on it, because I think it's really fascinating. It's also such an abstract but a really complex issue at the same time. I guess where is this more of a willingness to think about the limited use of nuclear weapons coming from? Because one reason I can think of is that, for example, in the case of Russia and Ukraine, it's sort of Russia toying with this idea of using nuclear weapons against a state that doesn't have nuclear weapons and that doesn't have an alliance with the United States or any nuclear power. But if we're talking about, for example, the Taiwan scenario, where it would be China deploying nuclear weapons in a conflict with the US, the same dynamic doesn't apply anymore, and it would be a nuclear armed state using nuclear weapons in a conflict against another nuclear superpower.
Yeah, so the scenarios are different, and I don't want to make it sound like this is something that only Russia and China and North Korea would consider, right? I mean, look, in the United States, I think there's a debate right now about whether the US needs more limited nuclear options because we fear that we're losing our conventional military edge in the Indo-Pacific, for instance, as China is rising. And so just as we did during what was known as the first offset strategy under Eisenhower, where we saw our nuclear capabilities as an important offset to our conventional inferiority vis-a-vis the Soviets in Europe, so too today might the United States also consider that maybe having more limited options for the president is a good thing if the U.S. ever needs to use nuclear weapons to offset conventional defeat, essentially. And so the scenarios are different, but really, I mean, this is born of, I think, military establishments looking to employ all the tools available to solve the particular problems that they're charged with thinking about and solving, right? So this sort of does get into, I think, some of the older concerns that existed at the start of the Cold War about whether or not nuclear weapons would be conventionalized, right? So this was the idea that nuclear weapons were simply another rung in the rung of ordnance that could be brought to bear by military. I mean, at the time, it was just air forces, right? The U.S. Air Force was the leader on this particular front. And so today, I mean, all of this talk, I mean, even the fact that we're having this conversation, the fact that these are issues that we worry about a lot more today, also, I think, chip away at this idea of the nuclear taboo and a lot of the threat making that has accompanied this from countries like North Korea, from Russia. China, notably, does not make nuclear threats, right? And so that's an interesting kind of distinction there. But the terms of, I think, how states with nuclear weapons seek to address their security challenges and resolve dilemmas in a time of crisis, I think, is starting to manifest in a lot more loose talk around the possibility of nuclear use.
I think another interesting issue on this note is something that we hear quite a lot about Russian threats with potential nuclear escalation. And that's a theory that nuclear weapons, since they're not really conventional weapons, are not actually that militarily useful, and that their biggest usefulness is actually when they're not being used, and that the real impact and the real strategic effect is the psychological, which only is in play before or until the nuclear weapons are actually used. That before you use them, you can threaten with their use, which then if you would actually be to use them, you would sort of lose this capability.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're talking about is a tendency in certain parts of at least the American establishment around nuclear weapons, where there's a distinction between the verbs use and employ, right? So some people will say, and I think this is a really kind of funny little saying, that we use our nuclear weapons every day, right, for the purposes of deterrence, but the employment of a nuclear weapon, the actual detonation of one of these weapons in a time of war, in anger, I mean, that is something entirely different. And I think that that distinction is not necessarily that useful, because we don't actually know why certain things don't happen in the world, right? That is that is one of the big kind of epistemic challenges of studying deterrence, thinking about deterrence, is do bad things not happen as a result of our deterrent messages and signals and capabilities and postures, or do they not happen simply because our adversaries have a different kind of ends means rational calculus that didn't involve resorting to whatever action we were trying to deter in the first place? But that does also, I think, get at some of the scenarios that we were talking about in the context of Ukraine specifically, right? I mean, when you think about the kinds of doctrinal preferences that are kind of ingrained in the United States, in the Soviet Union, and later Russia, about limited nuclear use, there are kinds of targets that lend themselves to limited nuclear use for military effects, right? So for the Soviets and for NATO, it was this idea of massed kind of mechanized infantry divisions kind of moving in, the old kind of Fulda Gap scenario in Central Europe, and like similar scenarios on the other side. But the Ukrainians, for instance, haven't been fighting against the Russians in ways that really would give the Russians, in terms of their own doctrine, big juicy nuclear targets. And so then you start getting into the psychological effects. And there you start getting into also interesting territory, right? I mean, the Ukrainians are already fighting an existential conflict for the survival of their country and their sovereignty. And so, would the detonation of nuclear weapons suddenly cause the Ukrainians to capitulate? Probably not. And I think you've actually seen a couple quotes from Zelensky himself to this effect, where he's essentially implied that the Ukrainian will to fight cannot be necessarily blunted by any capabilities because it's existential. And so you start getting into this territory where if there's no military utility and the psychological utility is also questionable, then what is really the benefit of nuclear use? Again, it can be that desire to convey powerful stakes, and I think, for me at least, that is the underlying through line that connects really everything that Vladimir Putin has said since February 23rd, 2022, about nuclear weapons in Russia. It is communicating to the capitals of Europe, to Washington, that the Russians have nuclear weapons, and that the Americans and the Europeans need to remember this, because who knows what could happen if we push our luck in supporting the Ukrainians. And this is exactly what we've seen in just the last few days before we taped this podcast, where Russia revised its nuclear doctrine right as Zelensky, of course, goes to Joe Biden to ask for a greater ability to employ American short-range missiles against Russian targets. So it's all ultimately part of, I think, the game of risk manipulation, which is so central to how deterrence messaging and communication plays out between nuclear adversaries in peacetime, crisis, and war.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thanks to Conductor for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation. How likely do you think that, given the fact that nuclear weapons are once again maybe gaining more of an importance and are becoming more of a force in international relations, how likely do you think that new and maybe up and coming powers will try to get their own nuclear weapons? Those states that haven't had them up until now, because obviously, in theory, no one is allowed to do that, but as previous decades have shown, in practice, that's not really the case.
Yeah, so since the start of the nuclear age, since 1945, around 30 countries around the world have had varying degrees of credibility in sort of pursuing a weaponized nuclear capability. Only 10 have ever succeeded. One of those countries has disarmed, South Africa, and today 9 countries possess nuclear weapons. Right. We also have a norm today that we didn't really have in the 1960s and 1970s against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. We have the Nonproliferation Treaty, which is arguably the most successful arms control treaty in history, requiring the states that signed up, outside of the 5 nuclear weapon states, the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK, to forswear in perpetuity, essentially, seeking nuclear weapons, and in exchange, they get access to peaceful nuclear technology. And by the same token, the only reason those countries would sign up to an agreement that, in a way, codifies special nuclear status for those 5 countries is because those 5 countries commit to work towards a world without nuclear weapons over time. This arrangement, the NPT Grand Bargain, is under strain, right? There's a lot going on today in the non-proliferation architecture that I think is really important for your listeners to understand, because this is going to be one of the defining characteristics, again, of this new nuclear age, right? Let's talk about the United States first, right? The U.S. is really unique in the international system for asking of its nuclear weapons far more than any other country asks of its nuclear weapons. And what do I mean by that? Well, we extend our nuclear deterrent to 34 countries around the world. And part of the reason we do that is actually non-proliferation, right? We do that so our allies, a lot of whom just happen to be wealthy countries with scientific and technical expertise in nuclear science and with varying degrees of nuclear latency, those allies might choose to build their own nuclear weapons if the United States is unable to sufficiently assure them. And assurance is never a easy task. It is one of the most difficult tasks. I mean, arguably, it is far more difficult than actually deterring adversaries. And so the United States has struggled with this over the decades, right? In the 1960s, we were worried about West Germany going nuclear, and so we added a nuclear planning group to NATO and took other measures over the years to address other types of allied anxieties. Today, I think we have a lot of factors that are really making this task more difficult for the United States. We have political dysfunction in Washington. We have the Donald Trump phenomenon, the America First phenomenon, where allies are genuinely deeply concerned that American domestic politics now has 2 schools of thought around the fundamental grand strategy of the United States when it comes to alliances, right? Going all the way back to Harry Truman, essentially, American presidents have broadly agreed that alliances are a core part of how the United States will seek to accomplish its national objectives around the world. And, I don't want to oversimplify things or be ahistorical. We did have difficult times with, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, with South Korea, even in the post-Cold War context. There's been kind of disagreements between the U.S. and its allies. But the presidents that we've had in the United States generally have not tried to upend the U.S. alliance architecture. That changed in the 2016 election when Donald Trump was elected and had a very different way of talking to allies about alliances, and did not share that belief that all of his predecessors, going back to Truman, did in many ways, about the value of alliances and partners in the nuclear age. So that's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is that we're starting to see a fissure really among the great powers on the value of nonproliferation itself, right? The reason we have a nonproliferation regime was not that we were gifted it or it was an act of altruism by the major powers. It was really the US and the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, both sort of independently coming to the realization, and it was a little bit more difficult for the Soviets, I suppose, that a world with more states with nuclear weapons and more fingers on the nuclear button, proverbially, around the world, was more dangerous for both of them. It didn't matter if those states were friendly to the Soviets or the Americans. It was just a more dangerous world generally, and that as the countries with the most nuclear weapons, their freedom of maneuver which is valuable when you're a major power, is preserved in a world where a non-proliferation norm can take hold. Today, I mean, the United States, Russia, and China in particular, I think, have a very different approach, respectively, to non-proliferation issues. Russia, obviously, I think, is the most concerning because it essentially has started to behave as a rogue great power, right? They're buying weapons from the North Koreans and the Iranians, for instance. They are, they essentially torpedoed a consensus outcome at the 2022 review conference for the Non-Proliferation Treaty in New York, and I could go on and on. So that again is a major piece of this puzzle. And then finally, countries around the world just perceive a more dangerous world, more primed for international conflict. And so again, going back to American allies, if you're in Warsaw or you're in Seoul, and you're looking at nuclear weapons being put into Belarus by Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong Un building tactical nuclear weapons in North Korea, naturally there is an inclination to think about nuclear solutions to your nuclear problems. This is very classic in the literature on proliferation. The security environment for countries is one of the most determinative factors for why countries would think about building nuclear weapons. And so we see this dynamic playing out. Now, let me temper everything I've just said, which is pretty pessimistic, with this thought, which is that I'm not a believer in a imminent cascade of nuclear proliferation, right? A lot of what we do have in the non-proliferation architecture is fairly resilient to many of these dynamics. There is, for instance, a large corpus of American sanctions law, right, that can't just be waved away by a motivated president that wants allies to go nuclear. And so we also have a non-proliferation norm where countries would become pariahs, right? If any country now leaves the non-proliferation treaty, they will be the second country to stand beside North Korea as the only country to have ever signed, ratified, and have left the NPT. So proliferation is not going to be a decision to be taken lightly by countries today, but almost 80 years into the nuclear age, I think we are looking potentially over the next few decades at the issue of proliferation, particularly by American allies, I think, becoming quite serious. And of course, I haven't mentioned Iran, but Iran is the most likely next candidate to acquire a nuclear weapon. It is the only non-nuclear weapon state with hundreds of kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%, which is not that far, actually, from what you would need to get uranium that will be considered weapons grade for use in nuclear weapons. The Iranians have not made a political decision to weaponize, but they are certainly hard hedging. So yeah, I mean, that's a long answer, but proliferation dynamics as well are intensifying.
Do you have any country in particular that you would say for whom it might make the most sense to get nuclear weapons against all the drawbacks that it would receive, or that it might be the most likely to do that? Sometimes the speculations are around Saudi Arabia or South Korea. Do you think that one of those or any other might be the most likely candidate?
Well, so in terms of what obviously I don't think any country should build nuclear weapons, right? But in terms of who is the most likely next proliferator, are we leaving aside Iran for the purposes of this question? Okay, so yeah, leaving aside Iran, which I think 100% is the most likely proximal proliferator in the world at the moment. The Saudis have said, Mohammed bin Salman has said that if the Iranians build a nuclear weapon, they'll build their own. So that's obviously there's a dependency there. So if you think Iran is the next most likely proliferator, then the Saudis may be next. Although obviously the Saudis have a very particular approach right now, especially to negotiating with the United States on the acquisition of enrichment capabilities, which is something the Biden administration is considering, which I think is a terrible idea. South Korea, I think, is the next big one in many ways, right? Rich country, tremendous amounts of civil nuclear expertise and scientific and technical expertise and human resources, amazing array of delivery systems, and they're establishing new command and control facilities for their missile forces, which is really unique from the perspective of a proliferator, right? We've never really seen a proliferator with the sophisticated missile force and associated command and control as we do today with South Korea. Big problem for the South Koreans is they have no industrial scale uranium enrichment or plutonium reprocessing capabilities. Could they build that? Yes, they have a lot of heavy water, pressurized heavy water reactor fuel that they could use to extract plutonium from. But it's not an overnight sort of phenomenon, right? Next door, you have Japan, which is sitting on a proverbial mountain of plutonium. They're the only non-nuclear weapon state to reprocess plutonium. Big domestic political impediment there, of course. Japan famously has a nuclear allergy, is the only country to have ever suffered nuclear attack. So even if security elites in Tokyo would view the acquisition of nuclear weapons as useful for Japanese security, let's say if Trump blows up the U.S.-Japan alliance or something after getting reelected in 2025, it would still be a very difficult decision. And then you have a few other countries in Europe that have had these conversations. The Germans, the Poles, but not really, in my view, credibly positioned to proliferate or to build nuclear weapons. Apart from that, there's not really anybody else that I would identify as a short-term candidate. You've had kind of comments from Erdogan in Turkey over the years. Under Bolsonaro, I think you had some Brazilians kind of comment on the prospect of nuclear weaponization, but nobody else really in that kind of scenario, right? So it's really South Korea, Saudi Arabia, outside of Iran, that give me the most concern right now. South Korea, obviously, an American ally, so there's a real direct, I think, dependency there with who the president of the United States is and how much that person can do to reassure the South Koreans that American extended deterrence will continue to answer the call. And then, I think implicit in your question is also, what do proliferators gain from nuclear weapons? And this is, an important question, because the view I have, at least in the South Korean context, is that nuclear weapons are good, in my view, for solving existential problems. If you're worried about the existence of your state being threatened, then nuclear deterrence is a very good solution to that problem. If you have a survivable second strike capability that can ride out an attack and retaliate. The South Koreans currently have that existential scenario problem answered for them by the United States, right? In any scenario where Kim Jong-un uses a nuclear weapon or multiple nuclear weapons against South Korean cities to, carry out horrific violence resulting in millions of deaths, I think it is very credible that an American president would be willing to retaliate with nuclear weapons. The problem now, though, is those limited use scenarios again, right? Is the North Koreans using one or a small number of nuclear weapons in against a military target. Would it be credible for the United States to respond with nuclear weapons in that scenario? The South Koreans want a blanket assurance from the United States that we would use nuclear weapons, and the U.S. can't do that because the U.S. never gives blanket assurances on nuclear use to any allies, because only the president can make that decision, and nobody can speak for presidents today and into the future in that kind of generalizable sense. And so that is kind of one of the questions, right? Even if South Korea had its own nuclear weapons, many of the problems that they now worry about with the North Koreans, I think, don't go away for them, right? They still have to share this peninsula with this country that's very risk acceptant, very willing to do things well below the threshold of all-out war that very much are perceived as security challenges for the South Korea. In this way, it's very similar to kind of the dilemma that India has faced after it built nuclear weapons with Pakistan, right? Even though India has nuclear weapons of its own, it has not been able to deter subconventional violence from Pakistan. And that is, I think, the essential lesson in international politics about the kinds of threats that nuclear weapons are good at deterring, and the kinds of threats that nuclear capabilities are not good at deterring, right? And so that, I think, is also important.
I'd like to talk now about each of the main nuclear powers, sort of one by one, individually. And I'd like to start with China, because obviously, when it comes to a possible conflict over Taiwan, that's one of the most likely scenarios, as we've mentioned, of a possible use of nuclear weapons, perhaps even in a conflict of two nuclear powers against each other. But I would say at the same time, we don't really hear that much about Chinese nuclear doctrine or even the Chinese nuclear capabilities, at least compared with Russia, where we tend to hear about it quite a lot, probably because Russians want us to hear a lot about it. But what is the Chinese nuclear doctrine, and is it specific or any different from the Russian one, for example?
Sure. So first of all, there's a lot that's changing about how China views its own nuclear forces, and there's a big debate right now about why this change is happening, right? We don't have a speech that we can cite from Xi Jinping, for instance, explaining what is changing in China. But we see the changes. We see new silos being built. We have assessments from parts of the U.S. government and intelligence community saying that China is going to have potentially 1,500 nuclear warheads by the 2030s, mid 2030s. And so there's a lot of change. But let me describe to you, what has been the Chinese approach to nuclear weapons, right? So China first tested a nuclear weapon in 1964 out of frustration, particularly that the United States was coercing China, compelling China by issuing nuclear threats during the Korean War and the first and second Taiwan Straits crises in the 1950s. And so Mao says enough is enough. China needs its own nuclear weapons. China detonates a nuclear device in 1964. And China announces the world's first policy of nuclear no first use, the same day they test a nuclear weapon in 1964, October. And that is interesting because they have done a lot since then to make that policy credible. So, this is the idea that China will not use nuclear weapons first under any circumstances. This is what they say, right? We can talk about how credible that is today. And that Chinese nuclear forces are designed to absorb a nuclear strike from any adversary and then retaliate with surviving capabilities. And this was very different from how the U.S. and the Soviet Union had thought about their nuclear capabilities at the time, and also the French and the U.K. Right, this was the first emphasis of no first use. So, in the decades since, a lot has changed geopolitically in terms of China's national capabilities and power and economy. But China has maintained this policy of no first use as part of their declaratory language. They actually see this as their contribution to arms control internationally. They've called for a no first use treaty among all the nuclear weapon states. But today, what we're seeing also is a big change in how China thinks about the sufficiency of its nuclear forces, right? One of the really unusual things about China was that as recently as 2019, 2020, when China was a major economy in the world, second largest economy, growing military superpower in its own right in the Indo-Pacific, we didn't see any change to China's broader philosophical approach to its nuclear weapons capabilities. China continued to maintain what they've called a lean and effective nuclear force. And then all of that changes very suddenly. So in 2021, we start seeing imagery found by open source analysts of new silo fields in Western China. Over time, we see two more of these fields discovered, total of around 360, give or take, new nuclear silos for ICBMs. China's building new space-based early warning capabilities. And so, the bottom line here is that a lot of what we're seeing now in China practically does make the Chinese approach to nuclear weapons look and sound a lot more like the American approach, right? We have hundreds of silos, and we have space-based early warning capabilities to enable a launch under attack option for the president. But we don't understand why all of this is happening, right? We also see an expansion in China's theater nuclear forces, right? And so the hypothesis that I have is that, a lot of this is, I think, ultimately about survivability. A larger nuclear force is going to be able to ride out potential attacks from the United States with nuclear and non-nuclear capabilities alike. Some of it might be about escalation management options. If the Chinese are worried about the U.S. pursuing limited nuclear use options, they might want limited options of their own so they don't have to escalate to the strategic level, which would be undesirable for a variety of reasons. Some of this might just be about inducing greater caution in the United States, right? Similar to kind of that Vladimir Putin approach to deterrence, that an American president who understands that China is a capable nuclear adversary or near peer. If I don't think China will be a peer of the United States, really, that president will then be quite cautious and quite prone to prudent decision making in a decision to intervene over a conflict in Taiwan, for instance. So a lot of this isn't really mutually exclusive. So I think many of these hypotheses can be at play. There's also kind of, the status argument, prestige argument. Xi Jinping has repeatedly called for China to have a world-class military. And if you're a world-class nuclear superpower, looking at the precedents set by Moscow and Washington, you have a nuclear force numbering warheads in the 4 digits, not 3 digits. Kind of a strategic rationale there, but hey, countries make decisions for worse reasons all the time. What I don't see evidence for, and I think this is important to state, is nuclear superiority. Right? I don't see any evidence for this idea that China might be seeking to outpace the United States or to have a nuclear force that is the largest or the most capable in the world to coerce or compel the United States per se. But the ambiguities in general are driving, I think, a rather manic discussion here in Washington about the steps the United States might need to take to countervail this changing Chinese approach to nuclear deterrence and nuclear weapons.
What would those steps might be?
Well, so the path of least resistance is to take some of the nuclear weapons that currently are not deployed by the United States because of arms control agreements and to deploy some of them. So deploy more nuclear weapons, right? So it's meeting a numbers challenge with an answer that emphasizes numbers, right? And so it's not this literal idea that we need one warhead for each new warhead that China is building, but it is a general sense that quantitative sufficiency assumptions that have shaped U.S. nuclear planning for the last few decades are no longer sufficient. But there is a broad debate in Washington about this, right? There is also, in the 21st century, unlike the Cold War, nuclear weapons are not just vulnerable to nuclear attack, they're vulnerable to conventional attack, they're vulnerable to other types of interference, cyber attacks on command and control, space capabilities. So there is this kind of comprehensive equation now of strategic stability that is going to shape, I think, the kinds of resource allocations the United States makes. You also have missile defense considerations here. And so while numbers are likely to be part of what happens, and this is just me speaking as an analyst, this is not my prescription for the United States. I do think the United States will, in some form, build or deploy additional nuclear weapons. That gets us into the territory, of course, of a new arms race, another kind of definitive characteristic of the first Cold War. The difference this time, though, is that, in the United States, we've been out of this business for so long that the nuclear enterprise in the United States is no longer as nimble and flexible as it once was. Unlike Russia and China, which are authoritarian states with the ability to marshal their national resources and will to rapidly make changes, as we've just seen in China. And so the consequence for the United States might be more broadly that the US is unlikely to be well positioned to arms race over the 21st century. And I think that is a really, really important consideration for how American planners and decision makers should think about addressing the challenges of this new nuclear age going forward.
Just a quick break here. In the coming months, I will be starting a newsletter focused on what you need to know and what you might have missed in geopolitics. It's completely free and you can already sign up for it, and it would be quite helpful if you do that. You can find the link for the sign up in the description below. And now, back to the conversation. I think I'm always a little confused when we're talking about the new nuclear arms race, because I think you've already hinted at it that nuclear weapons today are smaller and there's actually less of them across all the nuclear powers than we used to have or that they used to have. But it still seems to me like the US probably does have enough nuclear warheads and weapons to have enough against both Russia and China. And probably even though it has less of them and they're little bit smaller, it could probably still blow up the world a few times around. So is the new nuclear arms race about making more targeted and more limited use nuclear weapons, or is it about starting to build once again the really, really big ones and even larger numbers? And why is there the need for the quantity when you could say the quantity is already sufficient?
So I think we're about to open a really interesting can of worms here, right? Which is the American approach to nuclear targeting, right? So the United States has a nuclear deterrence strategy that privileges counterforce targeting. And this has been what we've done since the 1960s, right? So what does counterforce mean? It's a bit of arcane nuclear jargon to essentially mean that the United States seeks to limit damage to its homeland and its allies by holding at risk the nuclear forces of its adversary. And that includes nuclear command and control. It includes any kind of nuclear strike system or platform or launcher. So silos, road mobile launchers, submarine bases, all kinds of bomber bases at risk. And so given that that is the American approach to nuclear strategy and nuclear targeting, you can see why there is this emphasis on kind of numerical parity with the adversary's growing list of targets, right? Because we could take a very different approach, right? We could take a minimum deterrence approach, like sort of like China used to, where all we say is the only thing the United States needs to deter its adversaries is some survivable nuclear capability that can inflict unacceptable damage in return, right? That you retaliate, you cause unacceptable damage to the other side, assured destruction, if you want to call it that, and that is sufficient to deter. And this goes back to really foundational debates in the field of nuclear strategy, right? Between kind of, I mean, you could really set up Thomas Schelling and Albert Wohlstetter as the two kind of standard bearers of these arguments. Wohlstetter thinks that the balance of terror is delicate and that technological change and precise force balances matter quite a bit. Wohlstetter really does influence the American nuclear establishment, I think, on how these issues are discussed and thought about. And then you have Thomas Schelling, who's really concerned with, I think, the competitive risk-taking dynamics and this idea that deterrence can be fairly easy effectively, because if the adversary knows that you have a survivable capability to retaliate, that the threat that leaves something to chance could manifest and send you both careening off the brink into Armageddon, that will be sufficient to deter. And so it really is this fixation on counterforce in the United States that I think compels parts of the American nuclear establishment to not help but think that a growing set of adversarial nuclear capabilities does require the United States to have some degree of matching capability. And this is not to say that, again, it's not this idea that every Chinese silo means that the US needs to have two more warheads. That's how we think about targeting silos generally, that you want two nuclear warheads for a given silo to have a high probability of kill. But there is an element of that. And so nuclear planners have to sort of, I think, think more broadly, right? And then, of course, there's the role of presidents. Presidents get ultimately to set requirements for American nuclear forces. And so my hope is that we will have presidents again in the United States that are charged fundamentally with thinking about these big questions that presidents thought about during the Cold War, nuclear war, nuclear arms racing, the resource implications for the United States. Post-Cold War presidents in the United States have had the luxury of not necessarily having to really contend with these issues, right? Arguably, Joe Biden has been in this interesting position where in the context of the Ukraine war, he's had to contend with nuclear escalation risks, really fascinating because Biden was 19 years old at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? So it's just remarkable. I mean, he's old. I think we all know that he's not running for president because he's so old, but he's really been around to have been a functional adult during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and now to have thought about escalation risks during this contemporary war in Europe. But future presidents, I think, will really have to contend with these tough questions.
I wanted to get back to the China nuclear policy and the scenarios around it for just a little bit, because I guess if we're talking about it, what are the most likely hypothesized scenarios of how could be nuclear weapons used in a possible Taiwan contingency? Because the big issue that I think of is that if China would be the one to use the nuclear weapons first, the only way it could theoretically use them that would make sense would be to attack Taiwan with them, which not sure how much it makes sense to use nuclear weapons against a Taiwan that you're trying to acquire for yourself.
Yeah, so I don't think actually that makes a lot of sense, right? And that's actually one of the scenarios that I think is fairly, well, if not rule out, because you can't really rule anything out in this realm of what Herman Kahn called the unthinkable when you're talking about nuclear war, right? You need to have a fair bit of imagination to even talk about these things, but that's not the scenario that I think is most likely. It's this idea of competitive risk taking, right? So let's imagine that the U.S. military manages to very successfully and comprehensively interdict a amphibious invasion attempt of Taiwan. Biggest defeat for the PLA in its history, huge embarrassment for Xi Jinping, potentially even threatening the political control of the CCP over China itself. And so out of an act of desperation, it's this idea of resorting to limited nuclear use, right? So that could involve a strike on an American military base on Allied soil, let's say in the Philippines. It could involve an airburst over the Taiwan Strait or in international waters near an American carrier strike group, indicating that China is willing to escalate further, that the stakes for China are so much greater than the stakes for the United States. At higher levels of escalation could involve even attacks on Japanese bases that host American troops or facilities for the United States that are critical, like Guam. And so there's all these kind of limited use scenarios that start to look really dangerous, right? From the perspective of a broader U.S.-China nuclear war. Part of the problem is, again, we don't have a lot of transparency and understanding of how the capability changes that are manifesting in China are starting to affect their thinking more broadly about escalation management and control. The research that does exist out there might even suggest a more worrying kind of assessment that Chinese leaders and military planners might have fairly heroic beliefs about the ability to control escalation, that they might actually be fairly confident. And so that too is quite dangerous. But all of this, what we're talking about right now, is, I think, precisely the reason that American and Chinese leaders need to be able to talk to each other, to understand what exactly the thinking is in both countries about these kinds of dynamics. That is, I think, the essential lesson that we can take away from the first Cold War, right? One of the benefits, one of the good things at this point, is that we have been through we've been through this once. We have the benefit of history. We have the benefit of hindsight to understand why allowing unconstrained competition between nuclear armed superpowers is too dangerous, because that gets you to crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis, which leads ultimately to a discovery of the value of dialogue and arms control. And unfortunately, China has not been able to reciprocate American calls to engage in that kind of dialogue, but it's absolutely essential.
I want to move to another major nuclear power that's obviously been talked about a lot, Russia, because and sort of its nuclear doctrine. What would you say maybe is Russia's approach to nuclear weapons, and how is it changing, or how it might change, since basically 3 days ago Putin announced that the Russian doctrine will be getting some updates. So what does it look like now, and how is it going to look in the future? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.